organisms and organize them into things called populations. And a population is a group of organisms that are of the same species that are interbreeding. So they live in the same place and they're exchanging genetic information with one another. So we could really consider this class, well, I guess we're not really exchanging genetic information, but we're all living in the same place, right? So at least geographically, we could consider ourselves a population, or we could consider Western Wyoming Community College a population, right? We're all the same species, we think, and we're all kind of stuck together. But we're not the only population of our species, right? We can take those populations, the sum total of all populations across the globe, and talk about our species. And the species is defined a little bit differently than a population. It's defined as a group of potentially interbreeding organisms that, and this is important, can produce reproductively viable offspring. Can you guys think of organisms that are potentially interbreeding that don't produce reproductively viable offspring? Ligers, yeah, that's a really good example. So you can take a lion and a tiger, and they fall in love, and they have a baby, but that baby is infertile. It's not able to reproduce. Can you think of other examples? Mules, that's another really good example. Take a donkey and a horse, they work their magic, and the mule is infertile. Okay, so we can take species and populations in an area, and we can stick them all together in what's called a biological community. And a community is just, it's a geographical designation, and it consists of all of the species in that area. So we can think about the community of Rock Springs, right? There is our species, Homo sapiens, but we also have elk, and we have deer, and we have antelope, and we have a whole host of birds and lizards and snakes and bugs and fish and plants. The sum total of all of those species found in an area is called an ecosystem. And then if we include abiotic conditions like the climate of Rock Springs, that's called an ecosystem. So an ecosystem is the community, all the species, and also the abiotic conditions. Okay, so like I said, our temperatures and our precipitation and soil chemistry and water chemistry, things like that. Now what's cool is all levels, well, I shouldn't say all, most levels of biological organization have something called an emergent property. And emergent properties are defined as a property that's demonstrated at some level of organization that isn't demonstrated by the constituents of that level of organization. For example, each of us can sit here and we can breathe, right? Or yawn or whatever. And we inhale and we exhale. That's a product of our cardiovascular system. And what makes up the cardiovascular system is our heart and our lungs and our diaphragm. Now, a diaphragm doesn't breathe by itself. And hearts don't breathe by themselves. It's the sum total of all of those things working together that create this phenomenon that is gas exchange or respiration. Another really good example of an emergent property is consciousness. Each of us are in some way conscious of ourselves, right? We recognize that we're sitting in biology and paying attention to a lecture. And that's a product of, without trying to be too existential about it, that's a product of neurons and muscles and eyes and all of these things working together to make us aware of what's going on around us. So eyes aren't conscious of themselves. Our brain isn't autonomously conscious. It's the combination of all of those organs that are working together to make this consciousness thing. And then finally, recruitment. So I don't know if you guys have seen this phenomenon, but if you were to leave like a piece of pie or a piece of cake out upon your counter, if an ant finds it, right, all of a sudden there are a ton of ants that show up. That's a process called recruitment. Recruitment is possible because ants live in colonies, a combination of a whole bunch of individuals together, right? An individual can't recruit. It can't perform recruitment. But an individual, in combination with a bunch of individuals, can produce this phenomenon called recruitment. Okay, so there are going to be a whole bunch of themes that recur throughout the semester. Arguably, the most important of our biological themes is evolution. And I'm gonna blank the screen really quickly just so we can have kind of a candid discussion of what evolution is and what it is not. So, what have you all heard about evolution? Somebody give me a working definition of evolution without reading it off the slide.
Darwin theory.
Okay, so Darwinism. Okay, and what did Darwin actually say?
That we came from, not from a being up above, but we come from other species.
Okay, I love it. So, one of our common thoughts about evolution is this idea of Darwinian evolution, which is actually natural selection, right? And what Darwin said is, by exposing ourselves to environmental conditions, we become constrained in some way, and individuals begin competing. And whoever is most fit for that environment will leave the most offspring. And their genes, though he didn't know what a gene was, would become more and more abundant, and we would adapt to an environment. So that is a mechanism of evolution, but evolution is a little bit different than natural selection. What else have y'all heard about evolution?
Like throughout time we change and
Okay.
like adjust. I don't know if this is what you just said, but like our bodies change and adjust to atmosphere.
Okay, so I really like the first part of what you just said, that over time we change. That second part was, again, Darwinian evolution, that we adapt to environmental conditions. But you guys, all evolution says is that gene frequencies change over time. If you were to look at a population now, there is some relative abundance of specific genes within that population. Evolution says that over time, that relative distribution of genes within that population is going to change. And it changes with a variety of mechanisms. Arguably the most important is natural selection. And we'll talk a lot about natural selection and Darwinian evolution throughout the semester, because it accurately describes how the vast majority of genetic change is currently occurring. But evolution, all evolution says is that gene frequencies change over time. And there are a bunch of mechanisms by which that can happen. Random chance events can cause changes in genetic frequencies. Mutation can cause changes in genetic frequencies. So, evolution states that gene frequencies change over time. And again, natural selection is arguably the most important mechanism of evolution. And the way that you need to think about the relationship between natural selection and evolution is like the relationship between driving a car and transportation. Transportation is the phenomenon, right? Getting from one place to another. But there are a bunch of different ways that we can do that. We can drive a car. That's arguably right now the most important. But we could also walk, or we could run, or we could ride a bike, or we could ride a horse. There are a bunch of ways to accomplish that thing. That thing is evolution. One way that we accomplish evolution is natural selection. So, natural selection says that ecological conditions are going to cause populations to adapt, kind of. Really what it's saying is, given a set of environmental conditions, and given the natural variation between individuals, there's some individuals that are going to do really, really well in that environment. And there are going to be some individuals that don't do as well. Those that do well will leave more offspring, and they'll survive a little bit longer. Those that don't do well won't leave as many offspring. As a consequence of that, the genes that are helping that individual do well are going to become more abundant in the population. and those whose genes are less fit for that environment will become less abundant. Now, we can actually see this kind of genetic change using something called artificial selection. And this is how we have developed the agricultural systems that we do, or that we currently have. All the plants that we have in agriculture are a product of selective breeding, right? So if you look at things like broccoli and Brussels sprouts and kale, I believe it is, all three of those very different vegetables came from the exact same plant, which is a type of mustard. What we did was we just selected different parts of it to grow, right? Or plants that had like a larger floret. And as we selectively chose larger florets, we got a broccoli out of it. And as we selectively chose ancillary buds, larger ancillary buds, we got Brussels sprouts, or leaves, we got kale. And so we can see these kind of changes over time. Same thing with like horses, cattle, dogs, cats. Yeah. Now, one of the things that we're going to come back to again is this idea that natural selection explains two very disparate phenomena. The first of which is the diversity of life. If it's true that all life came from some subset of living organisms, whether it was a single creative event or multiple creative events, how is it that we get from that initial restricted creative event to our current diversity? Darwinian evolution, natural selection provides a mechanism for that. But Darwinian evolution, natural selection, also provides a really good explanation for how all life can be unified. We can get our current diversity from a single creative event. If we take that primordial soup and whatever unicellular organisms were swimming around in it, given a long enough time and at different conditions, we can get the current diversity that we see. Okay? So another recurring theme throughout the semester is going to be a flow of energy. What's cool about our world is that it's not a closed system. That is, we have energy flowing in, and we're going to have energy leaving our system. And it doesn't just come in from the sun and then bounce back off. It comes in and it's captured, and that captured solar energy flows through almost all biological systems. The vast majority, and we used to be able to say all, but the vast majority of biological energy has its origins in the sun with photosynthesis. There are some organisms that are able to collect solar energy, convert that into some type of sugar, and then those of us who don't photosynthesize are able to eat those organisms that do, and we're able to grow and do all the things that we do as a product of consuming that energy. Okay. Another theme that we're going to see recurring throughout the semester is this idea of cooperation. Biological systems, features within biological systems, are very rarely isolated and autonomous. Typically, they're working in collaboration for something else, some sort of emergent property. You can see that at the levels of an organ, an organism, or even between organisms. And the eye is a really good example of that. So the eye is a pretty complex organ. It has a whole bunch of receptive neural tissue back here. It has a large nerve that comes off the back of it that conveys information, right? But that's not what actually is collecting light. That's just what's making sense of the light that we're collecting. What's collecting the light is a lens up here. And that lens has a really unique muscle around it that constricts it or dilates it. And so this lens, in connection with some muscles, are collecting and focusing light. And that light gets focused on the back of the eye. And then the neurons that are being stimulated there convey some information to this optic nerve that sends it to our brain that makes sense of it. And so vision really is a product of cooperation between some very disparate kinds of tissues. You can see it at the level of organisms as well. There are symbiotic relationships relationships in which two organisms are living together. And if it's mutualistic, then both of them are benefiting from that relationship. A good example of that, and I'll show you a slide of it on the next slide, I believe, is termites and some internal gut flora that they have that help them process wood. Another recurring theme is that the structure of whatever we're looking at really defines its function. Eyes are really, really good at vision. They're really bad at grabbing stuff. It's really good at vision because of how it's organized, right? It's really bad at grabbing stuff because of how it's organized. Another good example of this are biological molecules called enzymes, which are just proteins. And an enzyme is something that catalyzes a reaction. It takes two things and sticks them together, or it takes one thing and it breaks them apart. Its ability to do that is determined by its shape. If it doesn't have the correct shape, it's not going to be able to interact with the molecules that it's either trying to stick together or break apart. And then finally, a recurring theme is going to be homeostasis. Again, homeostasis is just the ability to maintain an internal environment that's a little bit different than an external environment, which sounds mundane, but it's really, really important in the context of evolution because many of the adaptations that you and I enjoy are a product of maintaining an internal environment that's different than an external environment. You know, at certain temperatures, our body fluids will freeze. The fluids within our muscles will freeze. When that happens, our bodies die. And if our body's temperature was determined by ambient temperature, our geographic range would be greatly restricted, right? I mean, you and I wouldn't be living in Rock Springs because during the wintertime, when it's -20, that would be really bad for us, wouldn't it? What homeostasis has allowed us to do is to invade, and I'm going to use that word invade, not with a negative connotation, but just as an observation. It's allowed us to invade and take advantage of a whole bunch of different kinds of resources. So in terms of adaptation, homeostasis has been driving a whole bunch of that. Okay, so this is a picture of a termite, and it's dissected gut, and then the internal